Robert Gehrke is a native Utah. He was raised in Utah and earned degrees in communications and political science from the University of Utah. He is a multi-award winning journalist covering Utah government and politics for more than 25 years for the Associated Press and also for the Salt Lake Tribune, where he is currently employed. He has spent the last 6 years at the Salt Lake Tribune as an opinion columnist. My experience is that he's remarkably prolific. He has the kind of mind that thinks about a wide range of issues that are really important to the kinds of questions we've been exploring in this lecture series around how do we come together, how do we create equity, how do we think about the quality of democracy in a place like Utah, and how do we think of ourselves as citizens. He loves being outdoors. He's a sports fan. He has 2 kids. He loves his 3 dogs and takes them camping sometimes, and is about to embark on an epic river trip down the San Juan River, which will show a different corner of Utah than sometimes we get to see. We will go today until 1 p.m., although when Robert's remarks are finished, somewhere around 12:40-ish or so, we will allow any students that need to get to a 1 p.m. class to do that, and then we look forward to a really rich discussion and a Q&A period after that. Please join me in welcoming Robert Gehrke to BYU.
Thanks, Quinn. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me down. This is kind of wild. As you mentioned, I'm a University of Utah graduate, so thank you for not booing. But just to be standing in front of the BYU placard here is my first job as a professional journalist was at the Daily Utah Chronicle, the campus paper at the University of Utah. And every year during football rivalry week, we'd send a reporter down here. They'd send someone up here. And one year we dressed up, one of my buddies, James, in the cougar costume and raced people across the quad for quesadillas that we picked up at Taco Bell. So that has nothing to do with anything I'm talking about today. But it happened around the same time that I had this encounter with my editor. I was sitting at the office one day and he comes up to me and says, hey, Gehrke, what do you know about the World Wide Web? And I didn't want to look stupid, so I'm like, is that like an email thing? So I did end up looking stupid, I guess. But he says to me, no, we can take everything we write and put it on the World Wide Web, and people anywhere on the planet can see it. And I said, why the heck would we want to do that? And I didn't actually say heck because I mentioned I was going to the University of Utah at the time. But he's like, yeah, you're probably right. Why would we want to do that? I didn't realize at the time, and I don't think anybody at the time realized how revolutionary that was going to be, the emergence of the internet, its impact in the way that we communicate, in the way that it empowered people who didn't have voices before to communicate, and the way it disrupted and ultimately has imperiled our media landscape, and I think consequently, in some degrees, in some aspects, our democracy. And so that's kind of where I want to jump off today. This conversation I had happened back in about 1992, 1993. And in the decade since, we've seen a precipitous decline in the viability of the news media. And so this is sort of where I want to start. This kind of shows the advertising revenue. You see a big spike there about the time I was having these conversations with my boss at the time. Peaked, we're doing really well into the mid-2000s, and then you see this precipitous decline about 2008 with the recession, also converging with the emergence of social media, and the Facebook, Googles were kind of taking over at that point, and it's just dropped like a rock ever since. Circulation, you can see, has sort of held its own better than you might suspect, but what this means is without a viable business model, which is advertising dollars. We have advertising, we have subscriptions. Those are sort of our 2 main sources of revenue. From 2005 to 2021, there's been 2,200 plus papers that have folded. Between 2019 and 2022 alone, 360 newspapers closed. That was during the COVID years, a pretty rough time, because it turns out if everybody's shut down, there's not a lot to advertise. So the advertising dollars went away. In that span, 6,000 journalists lost their jobs, which is pretty remarkable. Between 2008 and 2020, I think I actually have this on the next slide. This one's a little bit of a jumble, but you can see in the top center here, between 2008 and 2020, 32,000 journalists, 32,000 journalists have been laid off. Right now, there are more people working in coal mines than in newspapers. It's a business that's really on the ropes. This one on the right, I kind of added this one late because I found it late, but it's really interesting because it shows not just the newsroom employees in the light blue down at the bottom. We've seen go from 75,000 in 2006 to 31,000 in 2021. But all across the board, in the production side, ads, sales, things like that, you've seen this 70% shrinkage in 15-year span in the media industry, in the newspaper industry in particular. And I should note here, I'm mostly going to be talking about newspapers, A, because that's my background, that's what I'm most familiar with, but B, newspapers are not pretty, they're instrumental in driving the news cycle. I don't want to disparage anybody who works in TV news. There's some great TV news reporters in our market. Ben Winslow is a legend. He's a hero to me. But by and large, newspapers are the ones that bring to bear the most bodies who are there at these events on a day-to-day basis and are doing the heavy investigative reporting that gets done in the market, and then TV and radio can follow in behind it. So I'm focusing on newspapers for that. I will say TV news has suffered some of the same downturns recently, both in the shrinking staff size that I'm talking about here with newspapers, also diminishing ad revenue, and just an inability to compete with the large cable outfits. You see the Fox Newses, the CNNs of the world. That's where people increasingly go to get what they consider news. We can discuss that a little bit more in detail. But because of the shrinkage in newspapers that I mentioned, this bottom left graph shows what they call news deserts. And that's 225 counties now that are news deserts. They have no local news coverage. And then you've got over almost 1,600 that only have one outlet, and usually that's a weekly outlet, which is better than nothing. And if you look at Utah, it's really hard to see, but if you look at Utah, we're faring better than a lot of places. Not surprisingly, I think these places that are news deserts are largely socioeconomically depressed areas or high ethnic minority areas, and you know, they suffer as a result, and they suffer because of well, the failure, the inability to sustain a news outlet is also a consequence. It's kind of a chicken and egg argument is what I'm trying to say. A lot of the newspapers that have survived over that period of time have been bought by large conglomerates to the point where 25 ownership chains now own a third of the newspapers in the country. And we're talking about the Gannett's, you know, the Times chain, Hearst. I'm blanking on one of them right now, but so they're owned by these national outlets. The Tribune, for a period of time, was owned by one called Media News Group, which was in turn owned by a hedge fund. And Alden Capital has sort of earned a reputation around the country of going in and buying these newspapers, hollowing them out, laying off employees, selling the assets, and then shutting them down. So that was the trajectory that we at the Salt Lake Tribune were on for a number of years. We were subsequently purchased by the Huntsman family and put into a nonprofit. I'll talk a little bit more about the benefits of that down the road. But my point being that we've had this consolidation in the news media market, and also you know, a disregard or disdain for the local aspect of the news that I think is so important. So going back to this news desert, 60% have no daily paper. So that goes to what I was saying about a lot of these are weeklies, and I don't anticipate that this is anything we can turn around. And I say that because a lot of young people in the room right now. There's not a lot of young people reading the newspaper. When my daughter was in fifth grade, she's older now, she's in college, but when she was in fifth grade, I got a call from her one day and she said, "Hey Dad, do we still have that stack of newspapers in the garage?" And of course we have a stack of newspapers in the garage. We always had a stack of newspapers. I wasn't going to throw them away. So she said, "Can you bring some of them into the school?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, they're going to want me to come tell everybody about how cool newspapers are." And then she said, "Because there are only 2 kids in my classes who've ever seen one." And this was a class of 28 kids. 28 fifth graders, and there were only 2 kids plus her, so 3 total, who had ever actually seen or touched or held a newspaper in their hands. And so this generation of kids, and I think, I think there were some factors there that made that a little bit unique, but their minds were blown when I took them in. They couldn't believe that they said, one of them said, this comes to our doorstep every day. It has the sports and the comics and all these pictures, and then there's some news in there too, and the obituaries. I don't know if they care about obituaries, but they and I said, yeah, this comes every day, and they couldn't fathom it. But I think what my point is that we're not going back to those good old days where people subscribed to newspapers. Everybody now gets their news on their phone or on their computer, more likely their phone, and so we've got to talk a little bit about not, longing for the days where we were making money hand over foot and had, robust staffing, but start talking about what's next. So why does it matter, I guess, is the big question, right, about why news is the demise of news or the decline of news. Oh, sorry, I meant to talk about this too. In addition to the declining local news in particular, it creates a vacuum that gets filled. It's going to get filled, whether it's by politically opportunistic and ambitious people who are posing as news outlets, conservative organizations with an agenda, or liberal organizations with an agenda. They are going to move in and fill the vacuum. So according to this Gallup poll, the trust in the media is at an all-time low. You can see the newspapers are at 16% trust, which is pretty abysmal. TV stations are even lower at 11%. And to be clear, this does not differentiate between national and local TV stations. But you can see we've gone from 30 up around 40% down to 16% in the matter of probably 15 years. And part of that is the media is to blame. Part of that is because we've had this splintering of the news world, right? We've had social media has broken it into all of these little pieces where people can step in and sort of promote their own agendas. So these politicians that have their agendas, this 2020 study that I have here identified 400 partisan media outlets. Most of them were conservative. Most of them were run by a small handful of organizations, and they were posing as news outlets. Because that vacuum is going to be filled one way or another. It also, we've seen this in the past, opens the door to potential for foreign national propaganda to fill in that void as well. It's something that we need to be concerned about. So, going to the next slide, why does it matter? So, you probably recognize this, rapscallion. He is the Prince of Wales, George Santos. It matters because the local paper that covers George Santos's district had flirted with the notion that he was embellishing his resume, but it never got beyond that, and they didn't have the manpower to actually make this a big story, and the national media didn't pay attention to it. The regional media didn't have the staffing to care what was happening in this New York congressional race, and as a result, you end up with the Prince of Wales is your congressman. So that's just one example, though. I always like to do this whenever I speak to a group, and I have a feeling that with this group it's going to be a little bit more, less representative of the average, but raise your hand real quick if you've been to a city council meeting. Okay, so you've done quite a few. And then how about a legislative hearing? Raise your hand. Okay, so a few less. Now, that's pretty good, because most groups I go to, 1 in 10 maybe some groups 25%, have actually been to one of these meetings. And the reason I bring that up is because for a lot of people, the news media, whether it's TV, radio, print, are the eyes and ears of the citizenry. They're the ones, the information you get about what's happening in your government, what's happening in your community, comes through either the pages or through the air and your TV set. And so that's important because in a democracy like ours, we rely on an educated, informed citizenry. And without getting that information to people, without somebody to step in and tell them what's going on, A, they don't know what's happening, and B, they can't be engaged in the discussion about what should be happening. And so, this Gallup poll that I mentioned here found 84% of Americans say that the news media is critical or very important to democracy, which is kind of interesting when you juxtapose that with the 16% who actually trusted the news media, or the 11% in the case of television. But there's also ways that we can quantify the impact of this diminished news media, and one of them is the areas without news coverage have considerably lower voter turnout rates. In areas where newspapers have suffered severe staffing cuts, the mayoral elections are less competitive. There have been other studies that have actually found that when communities have lost a newspaper or seen significant reductions in the newspaper, they actually pay more for bonds. They pay more to borrow money, which is kind of a strange connection, but it's one that's held up across many markets. And so another found, and this is the one that kind of worries me the most, I think, is that when you lose a local newspaper, you see an increase in party line voting. That leads to your political polarization that we've seen rampant in this country, and it brings it to a local level in a way that, isn't just a national, Democrat-Republican thing. It actually starts filtering down into the local level. And as I mentioned, when we're talking about the decline of credible news sources, that vacuum gets filled. And news in a vacuum travels fast. There was a 2018 study that said that false information, false narratives on social media travel 6 times faster than accurate, truthful information. So you can see something that starts out with a tweet that is salacious, it catches people's attention, and it could go all over the globe. And then trying to fight that with accurate, factual information is almost impossible, because this is propagating at 6 times the speed of anything that you can bring forward to combat that with. I mean, the old Thomas Jefferson saying, or the best way to fight misinformation is with good information. I'm paraphrasing. That's not the actual quote, but you can't logistically do that in the age of social media. So it also sticks around longer. A 2017 study found it has a longer life cycle, and it tends to pop up again and again over time. In 2019, there was a study that said over half, 54% of Americans sometimes or often got their information from social media, which is great. I mean, we use social media at the Tribune. Over about 30 to sometimes up to 40% of our traffic on our website comes through Facebook, Google, Twitter. All those three. Facebook or Twitter. Google is a different category. But social media drives a lot of information to our site, but it also drives a lot of misinformation right into your phone or into your device. So viral news is fun, I'm not going to lie, but often it can be misleading and lead to increased polarization. So, and this kind of brings me to sort of looking into the future. I worry that this is going to get worse. I worry that this social media, the influence of social media is going to become a lot more nefarious, because I don't know if anybody in here has used ChatGPT. I'm sure nobody uses it for school projects or anything like that. But one of my concerns is that with micro-targeting information that these social media platforms rely on right now to make sure you get that ad for the sweater that you were looking at, the day before, with that micro-targeting information, with all of the data that they gather on you, and the way that particularly in a political sense, they've learned to sort of identify you and target you with specific messages. They can start targeting you with specific news tailored to exacerbate your already preconceived notions or your inclinations, and that could be really it could weaponize both this micro targeting and weaponize the news media. I'm concerned about that might be around the corner. So anyway, so ultimately, like I said, news, in my mind at least, provides the foundation of our democratic society, one of the pillars of our democratic society. We need that factual framework to discuss the pressing problems we're facing, and we're facing some pretty pressing problems right now. We saw that if we don't have, my point being here is if we don't have that foundation of facts, we can't have the discussions about what we do next to address these issues. We saw that crop up a little bit over the past decade, 15 years, when we talk about climate change. I think that's more to a point now where it's people disagreeing on the urgency of addressing climate change rather than whether it exists. But more recently, I mean, during the COVID pandemic, the discussion wasn't should we do X or Y, it was does COVID exist? Do masks work? It wasn't a question of the nuance of it, and I think even more so with the 2020 election and some of the election denial and the misinformation that was spread as a result of that. You can start seeing that we're not even speaking the same language anymore in a lot of ways because we don't have that factual basis that we agree on to then take the discussion to the next step. So, so what do we do about it? And I think this is multifaceted, but there are some policy things, and that's why I put the picture of the Capitol up there. There are some policy things that we can do, and one of the things that I think that can be done is we can start letting news outlets bundle their subscriptions. Right now, that's not allowed. But you think about it, if you're subscribing to Hulu and Apple and Netflix and HBO and all of these things, and something's got to give, and you have to subscribe to each newspaper individually. The Tribune has a paywall, the Deseret News doesn't, but I think a lot more papers are going to that paywall. Something's got to give, and it's not going to be Ted Lasso. It's going to be the Salt Lake Tribune. I mean, I'm not giving up Ted Lasso. So if you let these papers bundle, offer a subscription across multiple outlets, you can start making it a little bit more realistic that people will subscribe. This liability reform is one that is, for decades, the internet's been largely exempt from being liable for things that are put on the internet. For example, if somebody tweets something on Twitter and there's repercussions as a result of that, they're not held legally liable for that. And I think that encourages sort of a recklessness. Whereas if I put the same information that was on this tweet in the newspaper, then I can be held legally liable for it. So I think there's something to be said for reforming Section 230 that would then encourage these outlets to be a little bit more responsible, or at least if they've already banned somebody for bad behavior and then they bring them back, maybe that shows a level of recklessness that exposes them to some liability. We can make social media pay for using the content, and when you think about this, in 2019. There was a study that said Google made $5 billion off of news content that it had no part in producing. Because it takes the content, sells its own ads on the back of it, and then people that go search for that content see the ads, and that's how they make their money. But if you think about that, it's like if you made something, if you made anything, if you painted a picture, and somebody took it and sold it for $5 billion, and you received nothing for that, you'd have a real problem with that. So what do we do? There's some discussions. There's a bill in Congress that's been pending since 2018. I'm not real optimistic that Congress can ever pass any meaningful legislation, at least in this climate. But this bill would at least give the news outlets some leverage in going to negotiate with these social media platforms. There have been proposals that go all the way to saying tax the platforms, set it up in a journalism fund to promote this. I don't think that we're in a climate that will go that far, but at some point, again, if Google's taking $5 billion and we're receiving nothing as a benefit of that, then you've got to start asking some serious questions about what should be done. The nonprofit news gathering is this is the model that I mentioned that the Salt Lake Tribune is pursuing. We were on the rocks, I think it's fair to say. We had gone from a position where we had roughly 200 people in our newsroom down to about 55, and when we got purchased and put into a nonprofit, it opens up these avenues for you to bring in new sources of revenue. For example, there are the Knight Foundation, the Reporting for America. There are these organizations. They're charitable organizations committed to fostering a news gathering, especially in underserved communities. Report for America has given us, is paying the salary, or part of the salary at least, for reporters in southeastern Utah, southwestern Utah. They were paying the salary for somebody to cover women's issues at the paper. There's the Ivory Homes, for example, has set up a foundation to cover housing issues and solutions-oriented journalism in the realm of housing issues. Now that raises, I will admit, some ethical quandaries, the potential conflicts of interest where you've got a developer paying for it, but you disclose that. We've not seen them try to put their thumb on the scale. It's potentially they could, but it's opened up these avenues for us to bring in new sources of revenue, to bolster our news gathering and help the community, I think. So I expect to see a lot more entities go down this nonprofit road. There are others that are like the Texas Tribune, which were a bunch of people who got laid off from these papers in Texas, formed their own online news organization, and because they're a nonprofit, can get charitable contributions to kind of help keep that afloat. So the last one is sort of, I'll just touch on it. As I mentioned, this news consolidation is a bit of a problem, especially when you're talking about groups that come in, hollow them out, and close them down to make their money. Antitrust legislation exists for a reason, and you can make it more difficult for them to do that, if not impossible. So that's the policy part of it. The next part of it is, I think, what I probably think about more than any of these is what I can do as a reporter to try to restore that trust, bring it up from the gutter that we're in, back up to some level of where people are going to value it. Because if they don't trust you, they don't value your work. So I think one of the things that we can do is show our work, especially when we're talking about digital media. You've got ability to show links, you've got ability to post documents, you've got ability to post interviews, particularly on contentious issues. Show your work so people can say, oh, well, this isn't just somebody saying this. You were seeing actual proof, verification that what you're doing, that this is what you're doing. We need to do more of that, and we've got the tools to be able to do it, and I think that goes a long way to building the trust. The second part kind of goes hand in hand with it, explaining the process. When we do a big, large-scale story, we should tell people what went into this. We did 60 interviews over 4 months and looked at 10,000 documents. So people can understand. They can look at that and go, oh, hey, I can trust this information. This is not just Robert, waking up one day and saying he thinks this is the case. They did some legwork that, when you start. One of the nice parts about this is once you start seeing that, you also notice when you don't see it. And it starts raising questions in your mind about, okay, well, do I need to look at this with a little bit more scrutiny? I said show your work, anonymous sources. This third one is one that there's a tinge of irony in this third one, distinguish news from opinion, because I spent 20 years as a straight news writer, and the last 5, 6 as an opinion writer. And I am one of the people that blurs the line. Sometimes my stuff shows up in the news pages, sometimes it shows up in opinion pages. We try to distinguish that, but I still get a lot of people who say, well, are you a journalist? I'm like, well, I'm a journalist, but I'm not a reporter, I'm a columnist. It gets too complicated. I think we need to draw a clearer line, not just me and not just my paper, but particularly when we're talking about, in this instance, television news, and particularly cable news. If you watch Fox News, if you watch CNN, you get about 2 hours of news a day and 22 hours of screaming about it. I think that the line has been blurred, and people are easily misled into seeing something and then thinking it's factual, factual truth, as opposed to just somebody's opinion. So we need to be more clear about that. The engaging in our communities, if we're valuable to the community, they need to see us out there. They need to recognize that we're part of that. They need to see us out doing our reporting, doing our work, and engaging in, educational forums, speaking to groups like this, that sort of thing. Meeting people where they are goes to what I was kind of to the story I told about my daughter and her, classmates. We've got to, if people are on TikTok, if people are on YouTube, if people are on Instagram, we've got to meet them there. We can't expect them to come back to us. And that's difficult because I am not TikTok ready. I can't dance a lick. But we're going to have to learn. And if we don't do it, like I said, there's a vacuum there that somebody else is going to do it. And they probably won't do it with the same rigor or standards that we try to bring to what we do on a daily basis. And then this last one kind of fades into the next thing I wanted to oh, sorry, there was one more I didn't put on here. We need to own our mistakes. If we screw something up, we need to acknowledge it, recognize it, and publicly correct it to the best of our ability. And one of the worst moments I've had in my journalism career was in 2012, and Adam probably remembers this one. We had a pollster who brought us back some numbers on two races in particular that we thought were going to be pretty close. Congressman Jim Matheson was running against Mia Love, and Ben McAdams was running for Salt Lake County Council. And we thought these were going to be close. They come back, and it looks like a Republican runaway. And it wasn't for another 24 hours, 36 hours after we published that we realized that the poll was completely wrong. I mean, fundamental errors were made by that pollster in giving us this information. And I had to write a story, a front page story the next day, retracting the poll, saying it's totally wrong and, basically mea culpa. Not Mia, it was they screwed it up. But it was embarrassing. But at the same time, that's the kind of transparency that we need to have when we screw things up, because journalists do screw things up. So this is the last one, though. This encourage a balanced diet. This kind of goes to what helping people understand that they need to take a whole bunch of different news sources and consume them all with some intelligence and wisdom. And I'm sorry, I had to put this picture on here because this old guy is shocked by something he's seeing on page 6. I can't imagine what it would be, but this is what we in journalism think of as our average news subscriber, and it's he's probably reading Dilbert. I think that's probably pretty shocking. But so what I was saying about the balanced news diet, we need to help people understand what they're consuming. And so part of that is, if you think about it, for decades, and this is why I called this panel Edward Murrow to Elon Musk. Edward Murrow is sort of the iconic news reporter. We went through the spell where we had Walter Cronkite and David Brinkley, these sort of trusted titans of the industry, and we had the equivalent in local news. Basically, there was a fundamental trust. And part of that, I think, I should stop here. I don't want to over-glorify it because it had its problems too. There were voices that were missing from that narrative. There was a tendency to lean into corporate interests or to trust the government maybe too much. But by and large, people trusted it because they understood that if it came to them through David Brinkley or Edward Murrow or these guys, there was some rigor, there was some standards there behind it, and it could be trusted. Think of it sort of like if you went to the grocery store and you're sitting there in the butcher section, and you have all of these choices of meat in front of you, and they all say it's USDA inspected. Well, you can trust that there are some rigors and standards there, and if you take it home and eat it, it's probably not going to kill you, right? We've kind of lost all of the rigors and standards checks that we used to have, and now it's the Wild West. We don't have any. There's no guarantee that anything that you see on the internet has the same sort of commitment to truth and honesty and the rigors behind it. So it's a different environment. I think there are a couple things that my point being in that is it's incumbent on everybody who's consuming news to be a little more vigilant, to be a little more thoughtful about how they're consuming news. The structure that we had in place is gone, and that there are several ways to do that. One is sample a variety of sources, right? If you see it in one place and it seems too good to be true and you can't find it anywhere else, it might be too good to be true, and you may want to think twice before you share it. Question the information. I mean, is the information relying on anonymous sources? Are there other outlets reporting that? Can you find a report, a study, something that's peer-reviewed that backs this up? The nice part about Google, even though I kind of bemoaned them taking all of our money, is that you can find things fairly easily if you need to check your sources. Share wisely. That kind of goes back to what I was saying about if something seems to be too good to be true, don't share it because it's already being shared much faster than it deserves to be in most cases. And learn to think critically. And I think this is the most important one. It goes back to asking to these things about asking, inspecting your sources, inspecting your information, and we've got to teach young people to do it because they're going to be growing up in a different environment. This needs to start at the elementary school level, and we as news media outlets probably need to be a little bit more engaged in that to try to help them do that. But and also critical thinking on its own is not a bad skill to have. It will serve them well later in life, whether it's in discerning good news from bad or just going out into the real world. So these are a couple tools that I like to use, and it's good. I like to think of this as sort of training yourself to recognize bias in the media. This is from a site called All Sides Media. And what it does is it takes the big headlines of the day and it will give you, it rates all of the news outlets on sort of a left-right political scale. And so you've got NBC News, which is slightly left of center. You've got Washington Examiner, which is right of center. The Hill, which is pretty center. I think the Hill's maybe a little right of center. We can quibble with the way they rank them, but they'll give you the same story from different outlets, and you can read them and see how they cover it differently, and it kind of dials you into some of the nuance in ways that a story can be slanted one way or another. So that's allsidesmedia.com. There was an app that I was tinkering with for a while called Informable, and you can download that at your app store. And what that does is it gives you a quiz. It'll show you a headline or give you a snippet from a news story, and you have to identify, is this news? Is this opinion? Is this an ad? Is there bias here? Is the headline does the headline, what's promised in the headline, live up to what's in the story? And it kind of puts you through the paces and just kind of tunes your brain into recognizing this sort of stuff. The last tool that I think is interesting, particularly if you're dealing with an outlet that you aren't familiar with, you haven't dealt with in the past, is this, it's from Adfonts Media. But he takes all of there's an algorithm that he's created to take all of these outlets and put them on a scale. Are they politically biased left? Are they politically biased right? And then up and down is the credibility scale that they have. And you can kind of see, you see some of the big guys up there, Reuters, ABC News. It's really hard to see. If you pull it up online, you can zoom in, and it's a lot easier to see. And down at the bottom right, you have Alex Jones, and over there on the bottom left, you have some very liberal, slanted organizations that lack credibility and also have a political bias. So I think that if you're encountering news sites that you're not familiar with, that you haven't dealt with in the past, this is not a bad place to go. And just I did this mostly out of my own curiosity. That has obviously a ton of sites on it, but I put some of the local news sites here, and you can see KSL, Channel 4, Fox, Deseret News, Salt Lake Tribune. We're sort of up in the upper left. They do give us a little bit of a liberal bias. Deseret News has a little bit of a conservative bias. KSL sort of central, but we're all above that yellow line there. So it considers all of these sources to be credible. So it's a useful site in that respect. One other thing I just wanted to plug is a friend of mine who's a journalism professor up at Utah State gave this really interesting TED Talk about Superman had to die so Clark Kent could live, and the notion being that the idea of a reporter as this Superman is kind of a myth. Even though it's a myth I always like to buy into. It's a myth because they're going away, and there's a void to be filled there that anybody in this room could fill, because we've all got the tools that we need. We've all got our eyes, our ears, our brain, and we have a phone now where we can publish on any platform we want. And so if you think about it, if the Salt Lake Tribune or the Provo paper, the Provo Herald, isn't covering your city council meeting, and you think something's happening there that people need to know about, you have the tools at your disposal to be able to go out and do that. It doesn't fill the entire gap, I don't think, and I think news outlets probably need to engage in communities and give them a little bit of training on how to do that in a fair and impartial and semi-professional, some ethical considerations that they need to think about, but it's something that can be done. And I've seen it done well, actually. I've seen people who go to their council meetings and get upset, post on Twitter, post on Facebook, and really can, inform their friends and neighbors and make a difference in their community. So look, I can't tell you what's around the corner for us any more than I can envision what the World Wide Web was going to do to us 30 years ago. Obviously, I've established I'm not a visionary, but I think we have a model in this country that has worked for the past 250 years. And that is, it's a democracy built on the wisdom and judgment of an informed citizenry. The news media has been important in that. We've been a pillar of that democracy. And as I pointed out at the beginning, it's that pillar is crumbling. So if we expect this to continue, if we expect this democracy to continue, and we expect this country to thrive, then we the people need to start doing a better job of it's a team effort to make sure that we the people are receiving information we can trust, however we get it, whatever platform we get it from sources that we can believe in. So that's my spiel. I take questions from you if you want. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I thought that was really outstanding. We do have some time for questions. We've got about 13, 14 minutes. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone. And just stand and briefly introduce yourself, and keep your questions concise so we can get as many as we can at the time that remains. Thank you.
We'll start here.
Super quick question. What's the name of that app that you were using?
It's called Informable.
Informable.
Yeah, I've got it on my phone. I could show it to you. I probably should have put a screenshot up there. It's mostly, I think, designed for sort of high school kids, maybe junior high, so it might be a little basic, but you can sort of gauge it. You can tell, how advanced or basic you want it. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I'm Fisher Dastrup. What would you say to people who don't see the value in expanding their, who they get their news from, especially on more of a political bias scale?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've got to, first and foremost, people have got to want to understand what's going on in their community, and we do have, it's so easy for us to get into these little thought bubbles that we live in. I think probably everybody in this room has had unpleasant conversations with somebody they care about because because they have kind of gone off the rails. You can't force people to want to change, I think, but you can show them, hopefully, that there's value in branching out and understanding, helping them understand things better. I think that there have been times where, I mean, even I felt like I have changed my mind about something because I'd learned more. And so if you can show them that there's a whole other perspective to this, you can kind of coax them along a little bit to kind of maybe question. Again, it goes back to what I was saying about questioning your sources and thinking critically about things. And so if you can coax them along in that respect, and there are people who won't. I've stopped having the conversations with my father about it because it's you try and you try and you try and then you just kind of avoid the topic altogether. So I think I guess the short answer would be is if you can show them that there's a different perspective and kind of coax them to think critically about the issues that they're deeply wedded to, question those underpinnings, then you can maybe get them to branch out a little bit. And once you start branching out, it's a whole new world out there.
Thank you.
In the back.
Hi, I'm Natalie Richards. I'm a public health major, and we have some of the same issues with like trust in the community and a lot of the similar struggles. And my question is, if journalists want to, like you were saying, engage in communities and meet people where they are, and if they're not trusting in the media, how do you encourage that trust in the first place? And then, like, do you find people are not trusting of journalists when they see them, like, in public, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's particularly in sort of the polarized political times we're in, and given, I mean, I'll just say it, given the attacks that we saw in the media from the past administration, there is a large group of people who ascribe to that political philosophy who do not trust the media in any way, shape, or form. I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about making sure you're transparent, making sure you show your work, making sure, helping people understand that the things that we're putting in the newspaper are not, we don't get the talking points from the Biden administration every morning that we have to then write up, right? It's more complicated than that there's a craft to what we're trying to do here. And there's and there's information, be it peer-reviewed reports, be it interviews, be it meetings with people, be it court records, that sort of bolster what we're saying here, right? And so I think if people could see that, I think if you can show people that there is a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of work that went into producing this, and show them why you're presenting it the way you are, you can bring them around a little bit. Some of them you're not going to be able to get to even listen. But those that are willing to listen, I think you're not necessarily making the case that they should care. You're showing them that you've done the work, that you've done the homework, and they can decide on their own that they care or not, right? Does that make sense? I don't know. We're going to go here, and then we'll come back to you.
My name is Samara. I'm a nursing major. Given the local news vacuum and like social media's role in filling that void, like what sort of infrastructural changes do you see would be required to make social media function in the beneficial role that local newspapers used to?
Yeah. This opens a whole can of worms because you get into the point where I'm not personally comfortable with government telling Twitter how to run its operations or telling Facebook that they need to do this or that in a heavy-handed way. And so part of it is creating, I guess, market incentives for them to do the right thing on their own. And that kind of goes back to what we saw recently, what we've seen with Fox News in particular, but we've seen also with Twitter, where the ad money goes away. I think if there's a financial disincentive for them to behave badly, you start seeing behave better. But that said, I mean, I also think that what I was saying about the liability issues that can be brought to bear, because if you have a legal structure that discourages care, and then you're encouraging bad behavior in that way too. I am encouraged. I think that Twitter and Facebook were kind of moving in the right direction when they were starting to do not necessarily fact checks, but sort of saying in Twitter's or in Facebook's case, hey, there's more information. Click here if there's this post may contain false information or disputed information. If you'd like to know more, go here. That's not necessarily policing, I don't think, the internet, but it also is kind of going to the question earlier about how you get people to look outside their bubble. It does kind of encourage them to look outside their bubble a little bit. So hopefully they keep moving in that direction. I'm not sure that they will, given Facebook might, Twitter, I'm not convinced will, but so I think those are some things that can be done. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan, and I'm a journalism major. And you mentioned the importance of local journalism, and I'm just wondering how you recommend going about finding that local journalism and news that needs to be covered.
That's an interesting question. So you're looking at it more as approaching it from a journalist perspective and finding the stories that aren't being told.
Yes, and just how to find the ones that people need to hear about.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing from my perspective is to be present, be out in the community and be talking to people, because there are a lot of people who have stories to tell. And we sometimes as reporters get in our little news bubbles too, where especially as a political reporter, I'm mostly focused on the state legislature for 45 days a year. And we get into that little bubble where everybody's competing for the same thing. We don't branch out and get down to sort of the grassroots, meet people where they are, like I was saying, but also just understand the impacts that those policies are going to have on people's day-to-day lives. And so there are a lot of stories to be told in that respect. And I think there's a lack of reporting on local city issues. I mean, if you're talking about, like I said, going to the city council meeting, going to the planning commission, there's some interesting stuff that happens there. Now, maybe it's not going to get you 10 million clicks on Twitter and make you go viral, but it's important because I probably didn't make this point strenuously enough. The reason local news matters is because it's impacting people where they live in their day-to-day lives, and if it's not there, then they're missing out. So, yeah, up here in front.
Hey, my name's Hassan. I'm also a journalist major. I'm just curious of where the line is, especially in today's society and moving forward, where the line between a journalist and an entertainer is, when especially in order, like, it almost feels like to be a journalist, you have to be like entertaining in a way, like you have to be able to engage with your audience sort of and still have that charisma. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. I mean, I think, well, there's some truth to it in the sense that even if you're a straight journalist, they'll often ask you to be on TV or be on radio, and you've got to be able to kind of ham it up a little bit. So I think there is an element of that. I think when you start sacrificing your news judgment and your news integrity and your news value for the entertainment aspect of it, as we've seen happen a lot, I think in cable news especially, you've kind of crossed a line, and you don't know where it is, I guess, until you've crossed it, maybe. But as long as you could be, to thine own self be true, and maintain your integrity and maintain your standards while still being entertaining, that's not a bad place to be. when I think what we've seen with the Dominion voting lawsuit and some of the things that have happened at Fox News, where they were out there saying things that they clearly knew were false and they believed internally were false, but were saying it for ratings purposes, clearly they've gone way past the line in that respect. So, so it is a fine line. I don't know if I can give you a clear, concise, here it is, but I think as long as you keep your feet planted in your values, in your integrity, in your standards, then you can be in pretty good footing. We got time for one more, or I can be done. Everybody wants me to be done. Well, thank you guys. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, hopefully you got something out of it. If you need to reach me, you can email me at gehrke@sltrib.com or follow me on Twitter at Robert Gehrke, and you can see me failing to do some of these things that I've encouraged people to do by being civil and congenial with our fellow human beings. So anyway, thank you all.